Welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England.
Hey everyone, welcome into an all-new episode of FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England. I am your host, Mike Leon. Ben here is the founder of FDAImports.com. He's a former FDA regulatory counsel who's been helping companies worldwide navigate the complex intersection of FDA oversight and international trade. Today's episode, very apropos for what's around the news, and that's around TrumpRx.gov, what it signals for drug pricing policy and how the FDA and customs enforcement can shift when government pressure campaigns collide with the pharmaceutical import activity. Ben, it's good to see you. There's a lot of talk about this because obviously, Mark Cuban's in this space and now the government coming out with TrumpRx. So what is TrumpRx.gov? Why is it significant compared to the statute-based or even the regulatory-based programs?
Mike, hi, great to see you. TrumpRx.gov is a website that was produced by the Trump administration, by the government. They have a top, what do they call it? A top marketing official or something like that, or top, what they call this official. They created a position that's designed to put together websites that actually are, that people will look at. And this one's pretty good when you look at it. TrumpRx.gov is a website where you can do some research about pharmaceuticals that you might be have prescribed for you that are expensive with and without insurance, where you might be able to obtain those pharmaceuticals more cheaply going to a pharmacy that participates in this program that the Trump administration has, quote unquote, set up. Right? It's really what you're looking at is that when Trump came in, he started going after pretty quickly the fact that Americans pay exorbitantly more for pharmaceuticals in the United States than say Europeans for exactly the same pharmaceuticals. I'm not talking about European versions manufactured by a different company of the same FDA approved product. I'm talking about exactly the same product that happens to be marketed in Europe rather than marketed in the United States, and the only difference is the labeling. Maybe the packaging is different, and the prices are substantially different. U.S. paying substantially more at the consumer level. And this has been true for a while. This has been going on for quite some time. There's been a lot of talk about it. And the Trump administration in the first term came out with a proposed regulation that would implement a provision of Food and Drug Cosmetic Law, the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, that allows for the importation of pharmaceuticals from Canada on a wholesale basis. That's not individual. That's not me going to Canada RX or some pharmacy or something online in order to try to purchase something, a drug, a Canadian version that may not be coming from Canada, or may be coming from Canada, but it wasn't intended there. It could be coming from anywhere, and there's no way to tell. Instead, this would be a commercial version, a commercial program allowing the import of pharmaceuticals in order to take advantage of the fact that drugs are cheaper in Canada. And this is in the statute. The administration put together a regulation. People have been trying to do regulation. Various times the government has been asked to consider a regulation, and FDA has said no. HHS has said no for literally decades. And under the Trump administration, they said yes. And so this regulation came out. Before the regulation, as it came out, the Trump administration said there's another way that pharmaceutical companies can participate in getting pharmaceuticals more cheaply to American consumers. And that is just import your own stuff from Europe here. We'll let you import it, and then you can just maybe make some modifications in labeling, and it would get to the pharmacies. It'll be cheaper. The reason is because there are price controls for pharmaceuticals in Canada. There's price controls for pharmaceuticals in Europe, and they're not here. So the pharmaceutical companies are not allowed to charge more than, say, $100. I made that up for a pharmaceutical. And the same pharmaceutical is sold in the United States for $800 because there's no price control, right? So the American consumer is basically paying all this additional cost to subsidize price controls. Now, this is not new. This has been going on for literally 25, 30 years. Since 1987, at least, when the first Prescription Drug Marketing Act was passed. What Trump said was, you don't have to wait for us to force you to do this, to do this Canadian import thing. Just bring your own products in more cheaply and make it available to people, at the most favored nation status, which we'll talk about in a second. And then your products will probably not be a part of the Canadian programs because it'll be cheap already. And that was all talk, literally. And this administration, he's put something behind it. There's a website. These are pharmaceutical companies that have basically agreed to bring the products in more cheaply to sell to American consumers through certain supply chains and through designated pharmacies that are participating in the program, resulting in substantially cheaper prices. If you go to the website and just like browse it, you can see the many different pharmaceuticals, and many of them are maintenance drugs. Some of them are weight loss drugs. Some of them are more sort of lifestyle drugs, but most of them are maintenance drugs. And they are remarkably cheaper, at least 50% cheaper, to purchase them through this supply. You're not buying it from the government. TrumpRx.gov is not a pharmacy. They're not selling anything to you. They're just directing you on the negotiations they've done with pharmaceutical companies to make them available through this supply chain.
Ben, let me ask you on that front, because the follow-up question for me is, how is TrumpRx.gov applying pressure to said pharmaceutical companies? We live in a capitalistic society. So how are they applying pressure to these companies in practice? And what indicators would you suggest any resulting price reductions are either temporary or more durable?
Of course, I think they're temporary. Unless there's a real fix, a real legislative fix that deals with quite a number of issues associated with pharmaceutical pricing and pharmaceutical management. The pharmacy benefit managers get a bad name for a particular reason. But this, I think it's temporary unless there's a serious fix that comes from Congress. How are they doing it? Tariffs. That's most pharmaceuticals are not made in the United States. Surprise. They're made in other countries. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, Donald Trump came out and said that he was going to throw a 10% tariff on a number of European countries because of the pharmaceuticals, because they weren't budging with respect to bringing the price down of pharmaceuticals coming to the United States that match the prices that are being charged in Europe. So he said 10%. That was February. This was the beginning of February 1. And then in April 1, it was going to be 25%. Well, that moves the needle. Those kinds of things move the needle. Now, I don't think that particular threat did, because that came a little too late, and TrumpRx.gov would have been well into the workings. But it's the trade policy, combination trade policy. It's the fact that this agency is forced to support the Canadian reimportation, and these are reimportation programs that are sponsored by states. The state of Florida has one. The state of Colorado has been working on one for quite some time. This is all in the press. I actually have done work with both those states on this issue, and Florida sued the FDA because they were dragging their feet in approving their program for allowing the reimportation or the importation of drugs from Canada under the statute. And the industry hates that. The industry, meaning the pharmaceutical industry, because now they're sort of competing against themselves, right? That their supply chains in Canada are being sort of drained for price, arbitrage in price, in order to bring it into the United States. So Trump, supporting that, pushing that, the Canadian import program, plus tariffs, I think those are the kinds of pressures. Plus the fact that he sits down with these people meaning sort of like the CEOs and top, the top decision makers in pharmaceutical companies, and I think he has the ability to meet with them toe to toe in order to talk about business and how it's affecting the United States, right, and then makes his advocacy. I think that's how he's doing it.
So Ben, let me ask you, staying on that front, because you just mentioned this 25, 30 years has been going on since the first act in 87. I mean, that spans, if my math is correct, 8 administrations. So when a program is temporary or politically driven like this, what risk does that create for importers, distributors, the pharmacies that are making these sourcing decisions based on said price?
Well, the pharmaceutical industry, the secondary pharmaceutical wholesale market. So if you think about it, pharmaceutical companies manufacture products, they put it into the wholesale chain. They don't sell to pharmacies. drug companies. There's too many of them, right? They don't want to sell to pharmacies. They certainly don't want to sell to individuals, consumers, because they're in the business of manufacturing millions and millions and millions and millions of doses, and they want that to go through a wholesale system, so they don't have to deal with people with millions and millions and millions of customers. These go through wholesalers. The wholesale, and then the wholesale industry, you have the primary wholesale market. That's the wholesalers who buy directly from the pharmaceutical company, and then those products will go through the wholesale distribution chain, and you can, and then there's a secondary wholesale market. These are the people, the wholesalers downstream. Once you get out of the primary wholesale market, the price of pharmaceuticals in wholesale fluctuates. It becomes a market, right? It's cheaper today than it is tomorrow, or vice versa. And so the buying it today is better because, getting the best prices you think you're going to get, and it is going to be beneficial to you. So it's already fluid. Now the pharmacies don't really experience that. The pharmacies get paid primarily through third-party payment systems, right? This is through Medicare, Medicaid, and third-party insurance companies. And so that's far more static, but the prices they pay can be more fluid depending upon who they buy from. So everybody's already used to a fluctuating market, which is temporary by definition. So the temporary piece of it is not necessarily frightening, I think, to the industry. Here's the thing I think that's mind-blowing about this. To the extent that the consumer buys into this and actually uses TrumpRx.gov in order to go to a pharmacy or find a pharmacy that's participating, and they buy drugs cheaper for cash than it would be to use their third-party payment system, it's going to change the market. That's a disruptor. And we're still a couple years into this. We have a couple more years to go in this administration. If this gets legs and it gets some economy to it, going back is going to be like the third rail, right? It's going to be like Social Security. Like, you don't touch Social Security. This could be you don't touch that program, because too many people are used to paying cash for drugs cheaper that came from the pharmaceutical companies directly. Well, not directly, but through a supply chain that can be trusted. Right. So I think the fact that it's temporary probably is less troublesome. But most of the stuff is still imported. And they're imported by, it's generic as well as branded pharmaceuticals. The generic industry is not as tight. The supply chain is not as tight. It's not the foreign manufacturer that has the approval exporting it. It very often gets picked up by its reseller, and it's coming into the United States. So you've got more flexibility and more risk for products coming in that maybe shouldn't be coming in. And that's where importers have to watch out, right? People saying this is part of that program and that's why it's so cheap, when really it's counterfeit. Right. That's the kind of thing I think that importers have to be particularly watchful.
Well, speaking of coming in, you just fed into the follow-up beautifully. Let's shift to the enforcement side. Like, how are the FDA, Customs Border Patrol approaching these gray market RX drugs right now? And are there sourcing patterns that have tend to trigger additional scrutiny?
Yeah, well, one thing, it has to do with popularity. So a good example is compounding pharmacy, which is pharmacy compounding, which is sort of a competitor to the pharmaceutical manufacturing industry. The active pharmaceutical ingredient has been made by either an approved facility or a facility that's registered with the FDA, even if it's not inspected by the FDA. And then the pharmacy will compound the pharmaceutical for you for the script. And they're doing the manufacturing in the pharmacy. This, by the way, is the practice of pharmacy. And it pre-existed the FDA by, 2,000 years, right? So FDA's, new to the game. And pharmacists know what they're doing. I don't want to say most, but a lot of pharmacies are pill counting, right? They're just counting pills and putting them in a bottle. Pharmacy compounders are making pharmaceuticals. So those APIs active pharmaceutical ingredients are going to pharmacy compounders. FDA doesn't like that industry, but it's built into the statute and it has been there since 1938, right? There's no getting rid of it. Plus, the pharmacy industry has been around for way longer than FDA. FDA doesn't like it. But what FDA can do is they can attack the source. They don't like the fact that a lot of these pharmacy compounders they're mostly in things like compounded versions of minoxidil, compounded versions of Viagra, compounded versions of Levitra, compounded versions of semaglutides, Wegovy's, Mounjaros, GLP-1s, right? Because they're very, very popular and they're much cheaper than buying the manufactured product. that industry, the government is going after, FDA and customs. FDA is inspecting a lot of these API manufacturers. Many of them are in India or in China, and trying to sort of get them onto a list. They send requests for records, and if the company doesn't get it back fast enough, then they can put them on a list for refusing an inspection. And getting off that list is very, very difficult. At the border, every manufacturer that exports a drug to the United States must identify their known importers. So FDA and customs use those supply chains in order to determine whether or not a particular shipment is likely legitimately from a particular manufacturer, because the manufacturer has to make that designation in the FDA system. It's not like a piece of paper that says this is our authorized importer. Those don't exist. So FDA and customs, they're focusing in on these areas where they feel like there's a greater risk of unapproved or counterfeit versions of very popular medications that are usually not necessarily maintenance products, right? They tend to be lifestyle drugs because they're very, very popular, very, very expensive in the marketplace. And this is a cheaper way for consumers to get them. And so didn't get a lot of detail there, but they use their screening mechanisms in order to target counterfeits, the gray market stuff, the stuff that they don't want here. They're trying to do the right thing. They're trying to prevent consumers from getting unsafe drugs by stopping the active ingredient inbound that the FDA thinks is unsafe. But they have to have evidence for that. FDA just can't stop that stuff. They don't have the authority to do that. They have to actually be able to articulate why that particular API active ingredient from that manufacturer appears to have a problem. So it's complicated, but it's fascinating to see this happen because it's never happened before. And I think it's a game changer ultimately. I think it's going to have a real impact in the prices of pharmaceuticals that people are going to have a hard time backing away from.
Yeah. It's complicated, but you're here to break it all down for us as always, Ben. I can't thank you enough for explaining all this to the audience. Appreciate it.
Great. Good to see you, Mike.
That's it for today's episode of FDA Imports, Cross-Border Compliance. If your business right now is dealing with FDA or customs pressure on pharmaceutical imports, APIs, supply chain documentation, whatever it is, maybe you just want to assess the risk before your next shipment. Do me a favor right now, visit FDAImports.com to connect with Ben and his team. And if you found the episode helpful, do me one more favor, hit that like button, hit subscribe, leave a review, comment, share the episode with someone who needs to hear it. I am Mike Leon. We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.